So, LiquidZulu made a 3.5-hour video about Dave Smith. With that, he is probably the first libertarian ever to tell another libertarian that he is not a real libertarian. I love this shit. And since I'm a German libertarian who recently made his first English video about how Javier Milei is not a real libertarian, I'm going a little bit deeper. And since Dave Smith already said that he has no interest in debating LiquidZulu, and for a lot of people it feels like a waste of time to watch a 3.5-hour video about true libertarianism straight from the ivory tower, I thought to myself, why not give it a try and summarize the whole video by getting into the most important details. But before I'll do that, let me introduce myself for about 2 minutes. My name is Andreas Tank and I translated important works like America's Great Depression and A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism from Murray Rothbard and from Hans-Hermann Hoppe from English to German, and most recently I translated The Critique of Causal Scientific Social Research, one of Hoppe's earlier works in German from 1983, to English for the Mises Institute and for stefankinsella.com, who I recently met at the Free Cities conference in Prague. I spent the last weeks and months with summarizing the works of Oskar Grau, Saifedean Ammous, Christopher Hansen, Hans-Hermann Hoppe, Jörg Guido Hülsmann, Bob Murphy, and others, against Philipp Bargus, who is backing up Javier Milei with false Austrian theory that closing down the central bank would cause hyperinflation, which is most definitely not what Ron Paul thought about when he wrote End the Fed. But we will get to Ron Paul a little bit later. Also, I once engaged with Dave Smith on Twitter when I asked him what he meant in a podcast with Michael Mellis, where he said he doesn't like false libertarian narratives like good ideas don't require force. Since I used that phrase frequently, I asked him kindly how I was supposed to interpret this, and he answered something like that if he or his family is held hostage, that he would very openly use force. I answered that in this situation he is speaking out of self-defense, but I thought that pretty much every libertarian is crystal clear about the phrase good ideas don't require force, that they mean the initiation of force. Dave answered, well, if you really like to split hairs, I guess you're right about that. And I'm telling this for 2 reasons. First, it is obviously possible to talk to Dave or ask him a question if you're not a dick about it. I answered him that I want to be sure what he meant, since I just translated Getting Libertarianism Right from Hoppe, and that I always make sure I am talking about the initiation of force and not defensive force, and Dave liked my comment. Second, I think all LiquidZulu does in the whole video is taking slightly ambiguous statements of Dave over hours and hours of podcasts and blaming him to totally not get anything about the philosophy of libertarianism. I found this really embarrassing to watch. What I actually like about Dave Smith and what I think made him so successful is that he is not an academic who teaches economics at some university, but that he's a stand-up comedian who can explain libertarianism to people who wouldn't understand or wouldn't be interested in a deep dive into philosophy. But unfortunately, this is all LiquidZulu cares about. One of the first things he shows in his video is Dave Smith standing in front of the Mises Caucus and telling the crowd that he is a child of the Ron Paul movement and that the only way of getting votes for the Libertarian Party is by spreading the ideas of libertarianism. This was a new way of looking at the LP, which was until then ruled by pragmatists. Now, LiquidZulu has this really black and white view of separating, in his eyes, real libertarianism from pragmatism, which is pretty much statism. I think it's ironic that LiquidZulu would never go so far to blame Ron Paul for being not a real libertarian, even though Ron Paul is a Republican and a constitutionalist, which is very obviously some kind of pragmatic way to look at libertarianism. So, like I already said, I don't want to react to the whole video and waste everybody's time with like a 7 hours video. I will now focus on 5 main points out of LiquidZulu's video. First, we will look into this bum on a public playground in New York story, which will lead us to homesteading, and LiquidZulu's interpretation of Murray Rothbard's strategy of libertarian Leninism. I'll explore in a little bit more detail what Rothbard probably meant when he talked about implementing pure libertarian theory by strict cadres, and move from there to the podcast between Dave and Andrew, where they talk about principles like conscription and incest. Then I want to look a little bit closer into the Libertarian Party of 2024 and Michael Rechtenwald before discussing the issue of open borders. And finally, I will try to point out how LiquidZulu is trying to sneak objectivism into libertarianism, while he is disregarding the flaws of objectivism. So, let's go. The first thing LiquidZulu starts into this debate with Dave Smith, and where they probably don't agree, is this story about the bum on the playground in New York. Dave Smith told this story in podcasts and interviews where he is with his kid on a playground in the middle of New York, and there is a bum laying on a bench with a fentanyl needle next to him, and he called the cops that they removed the bum so his child is no longer in danger. And LiquidZulu actually really makes the point regarding property rights, that Dave Smith is not a true libertarian because he called the cops, which is a statist thing. And he calls the state to remove the bum so that his child is no longer in danger. And he considers this to be unlibertarian. And I think Dave Smith is absolutely right to tell people that this is not the point of libertarianism. And even if it would be, then I would myself consider no longer to be a libertarian. And I think this is pretty valid. So we have different theories. The one LiquidZulu is making is that state property is not property at all. So far, so good. Libertarians agree with that principle, at least basically. But the question now arrives, since the state is the owner of the playground and of government property, it might not be the legitimate owner, but it is an owner. And the alternative to respect every property as completely open to homesteading is a theory that has not really worked out in theory. But let us go to the point where LiquidZulu gets this from. And this is, you can find it actually on Mises.org. I looked for it, and it's called Confiscation and the Homestead Principle of Murray Rothbard from the year 1969. And I won't go through the whole article. I will just scroll down a little bit and make the point a little bit clear for everyone what Murray Rothbard is actually arguing. He says, quote, suppose, for example, that A steals B's horse, then C comes along and takes the horse from A. Can C be called a thief? Certainly not, for we cannot call a man a criminal for stealing goods from a thief. On the contrary, C is performing a virtuous act on confiscation, for he is depriving thief A of the fruits of his crime of aggression, and he is at least returning the horse to the innocent private sector and out of the criminal sector. C has done a noble act and should be applauded. Of course, it would be still better if he returned the horse to B, the original victim. But even if he does not, the horse is far more justly in C's hand than it is in the hands of A, the thief and criminal. So, I'm normally really not someone who disagrees with Murray Rothbard. But we can actually look at that, and this doesn't seem really that logical. Is it? I mean, we are all for retribution. We want justice, like ethics, like a legal moral system. But this is not, because there is no retribution in this example. Let's just for a short moment look at the time when this was actually written by Murray Rothbard. 1969. Well, this was 1 year after Woodstock and the hippies and these people who, from the left, who claim to get into houses and homestead them. This happens actually a lot. I'm from Germany. I know these projects where leftists are sitting in houses and the state actually let them be. But it doesn't really work this way. This is not completely thought through, and I think this is the reason why it was never, at least not yet, published at Mises.org, but I find it on panarchy.org, because this reminds me more of a left-wing idea. So the idea of, like this is called libertarian Leninism, what LiquidZulu actually does, he's coming from a left-wing perspective, and a completely left-wing perspective. But like Dave Smith and Jeremy Kaufman and a lot of other of these people, we call ourselves right now right-wing conservative libertarians. And this is a huge difference. LiquidZulu always does this trick that he makes it seem like there's only one objective true answer. But everything else is just pragmatism and consequentialism. But this is hardly the case. Let's look at another text of Murray Rothbard, and this is called Right-Wing Populism. And this is much later, from January 1992, and this is called a right-wing populist program. I'm not going through the whole article. You can find it if you just watch for right-wing populism. And he has several points. First, slash taxes. All taxes, sales, business, property, etc., but especially the most oppressive politically impossible, the income tax. Everything must be abolished. Second, slash welfare. Third, abolish racial or group privileges, so this means no affirmative action whatsoever. Fourth, take back the streets, crush criminals. This is again later what Hoppe says in Getting Libertarianism Right with the famous slogan, crush the anti-fascist mob. And now the important part comes. 5, take back the streets, get rid of the bums. A little bit deeper, again, unleash the cops to clear the streets of bums and vagrants. Where will they go? Who cares? Hopefully they will disappear. That is, move from the ranks of the pitted and corseted bums class to the ranks of the productive members of society. And 6, abolish the Fed, and 7, America first. So just in short, what are we looking at here? We are looking at different time zones, where at the first part, Murray Rothbard was in a time which was at all more conservative, more on the progressive side. And at the later point, he is more taking the side of conservative point when the public is more progressive. And this is pretty much the point. LiquidZulu now does this in a way where he says everything that is not pure theory, and this is quoting Rothbard. He is exactly making this point in right-wing populism itself. He says we have to look at cadres, like from the Lenin perspective, they had socialist cadres and we need libertarian cadres. So people propagating the pure theory of libertarianism. But this is not crystal clear. Not at all. At all points, LiquidZulu will step into these points and say, well, this is consequentialist and so we have to deny it. But if you take a deeper look, it is consequentialist at both sides. So the homesteading principle of the bum in New York City is as consequentialist as the other part of the right-wing populism part, where he actually involves the statist cops. So LiquidZulu always tries to make points and make them seem that this is totally obvious. And this kind of thinking comes from objectivism. Objectivism, the theory of Ayn Rand and now more of Leonard Peikoff, always has this thing where he says there's truth and there are consequences from action, and you cannot ignore the consequences. You have to adhere to truth, always. I kind of accept some of these positions, but not in all regards. Especially objectivists do a lot of mistakes. And maybe even LiquidZulu would agree with me that, for example, he's not for intellectual property like Leonard Peikoff and Ayn Rand are. But he would say, okay, well, this is not a closed philosophy, but we are taking these parts that are correct and disregard other aspects that are incorrect. And I would agree to that, but objectivism has always the point that this is truth and there goes nothing beyond this point. And I completely disagree with that. And guess who else does? Ron Paul. 2 weeks ago, I was at the Free Cities conference in Prague, and Yaron Brooks, the head of the Ayn Rand Institute, had a speech, and he said, freedom is not enough, or liberty is not enough. I'm not quite sure, but doesn't matter. And other people asked, well, what is the most important thing? And he said happiness. And then he made this example of a lifeboat scenario where he said, look, would you rather save your children or would you save the neighbor's children? And of course, everyone answers, well, my own children instead of the neighbor's children I would save, obviously. But when you come up with the same scenario, but you would ask a mother with a child, would you rather die yourself or and save your child, or would you rather throw your child into the ocean and survive yourself? Then I think almost 99% of all mothers in the whole world would say, I would sacrifice myself. And you can't get this idea into an objective theory that always comes out as true. But in the conversation between Dave Smith and Andrew, it was pretty much the same. Dave Smith is a family father, and he argues that his wife and his children are worth more to him than his own life. And Andrew disagrees with that. And this is the part where the conscription comes in. Andrew, a lot of people argued in comments on Twitter about this topic with the conscription, and they never came close to the point where you're saying, well, where is the point where Dave Smith actually is for conscription? He hadn't made a single example. He just said, okay, conscription is incredibly evil, but he didn't say where he would actually make an excuse for conscription. He had no point. So he says conscription bad, but maybe he could think of an example. And the whole reason for that is because he thinks my life is worth sacrificing for things, for my children, for my wife, who I care actually more than for my own life. And Andrew disagrees with that. And that's the basic reason I think you cannot get objectivism into libertarianism as a whole, because it would fail in this attempt of the virtues of selfishness. And Ron Paul disagrees with this as well. Some things in the world from a subjective value theory might be worth it to sacrifice your own life. And Dave agrees with that, and LiquidZulu would completely deny that and said, you are wrong, always in every detail. So, and this is the main point. LiquidZulu has this weird form of anarcho-capitalist with sneaking objectivism into it, and he's just not always correct. He just assumes that there's always this completely 100% true libertarian perspective. But regarding the subjective value theory, this is critical to a huge amount of topics where people actually disagree with each other. So I think Dave does the by far more important job of right-wing populism. He pretty much does this perfectly in the regards of Murray Rothbard and of Hans Hermann Hoppe, and I think he actually gets these ideas out. And I think I'm myself are completely contributing to theory, and I'm sitting in the ivory tower, and I'm not really a pragmatist who says, well, we can do A, but we can't do B. But pretty much every libertarian in the United States and worldwide think Ron Paul is completely right. And why is that? Because Ron Paul always said, no excuses for, well, we get a little bit of more freedom, but a little bit less freedom in that point. And, well, so shall we do it? Well, in this point, he always says no to everything. And this is pretty much the principles Dave Smith agrees on. And so what LiquidZulu does, and I think this is really embarrassing in his whole video, he does this like the Naked Gun things, where Dave Smith is not saying the 100% true things, but he's like waving around. In this conversation with Andrew asked Dave, prove to me that you own your own body. And Dave Smith, like irritated, saying, I'm doing this right now. And I thought every libertarian who watched LiquidZulu's video made himself this, oh my God, Andrew, LiquidZulu, what are you actually talking about? Dave Smith is, what he's trying to say here is, look, I'm completely in control of my own body. I'm sitting in this podcast with you. I'm not leaving. I'm answering. I'm using my mouth. I'm using my muscles. I'm listening to you. This is the proof that I'm owning my own body. And Andrew doesn't want to get that. LiquidZulu doesn't want to get that. The other person they took into this podcast, he just wants to get this textbook, Stefan Kinsella, Homestead Principle of Your Own Body. And I think this is kind of ridiculous, because we are talking about semantics, about stuff like, I want my words to come out of your mouth. And I think this is actually a problem that most libertarians have. We have too much egos, and, well, we are too selfish. We want to hear everything in our own words, and we don't care that much about, does this work for other people? Do they describe it this way? Which LiquidZulu wants to be taken down as pragmatism, which is not, or consequentialism, which is actually not, but all the times there are, because of subjective value theory, pretty much everyone has a little bit of deviation of how he thinks and how he would describe actual things instead of another person. So we will never get to this result where everyone agrees on basic theories. We always make a little bit deviation in how we say these things. I think this was especially ridiculous when the topic came to open borders, because what LiquidZulu did was getting a video of Ron Paul of 1988 out and says, well, Ron Paul doesn't actually speak a lot about open borders. He just says that, well, in a free society, if we open the borders, then people come from A to B, where there is more work, from where there is less work, and everyone would be happier. And LiquidZulu, and I think this must not be a mistake, but he actually did this on purpose. He just completely neglected how Ron Paul said, in a free society. Well, we don't live in a free society. You can't talk about open borders and neglect the welfare state. So this makes borders the first principles, because people are more interested in security and safety for their people and their neighborhood before they can even say, well, how am I supposed to live when my property rights are in theory there, but I'm not sure if they are enforced. So I need this order, and this order must be actually here. So we much rather would live in some kind of a socialist society where we are not robbed than to live in complete freedom but in absolute chaos, because everyone is robbing each one all the time. This is the difference between anarchism and complete chaos. And it seems to more people that LiquidZulu actually likes chaos. He doesn't like anarchy. Anarchy is order, but you have to enforce these orders. And Murray Rothbard agrees with that. And Hopper agrees with that. And a lot of other people as well. So, and with that being said, I want to come to a last short part and of Michael Rechtenwald within the Libertarian National Convention of 2024, because I really like Michael Rechtenwald, and I thought this was such a huge win for the Libertarian Party. They never had such a great success ever before, and I don't think that LiquidZulu has ever written one of the books of Michael Rechtenwald, and I think he's probably a much better writer than he is a speaker. I haven't read a lot of his, I think 19 books or what is, but I read The Google Archipelago, and was a pretty good book. And I think what Michael Rechtenwald, LiquidZulu just says he's a guy who was kicked out of the left, and now he starts with anti-Zionism, which is, I think, an important point, and Dave Smith does an excellent job in this regard. I learned a lot from him. But Michael Rechtenwald actually was really good at certain points. I liked for the short time it actually existed on Mises Media, his podcast Wrecked, where I actually thought this had a great name. And I thought this edible gummy bear was one of the most badass things that ever happened. I mean, look, I imagine this situation. Somehow, Dave Smith wants to enact within the Libertarian Party and make a little bit of pressure on Donald Trump to integrate more libertarian values in the Trump regime and the Republicans. And then he says, well, come on, president candidate for the Libertarian Party, that gets me nowhere. I'm a stand-up comedian and much more successful when I do my own stuff than being the official candidate for the Libertarian Party. I'm never going to get president. So this left a gap, completely understandable. And now I imagine Angela McArdle actually get into this pressure to find a new candidate. She's head of the Mises Caucus, and she was like phoning around and asking everyone she could get off, like maybe people like Tom Woods, don't you want to be the candidate? And they said no. And so she found Michael Rechtenwald, and they had a phone call, and he was actually like, yeah, Michael, do you want to be the president of the Libertarian Party? And he's like, wait, what is in there for me? Oh, nothing much, but yeah, well, if we win, then you could become president. Yeah, well, I think this is off the table. Yeah, okay, most definitely. But we have certain arrangements. We want Donald Trump to free Ross Ulbricht. We want him to leave Bitcoin unregulated. I think we might get that, and maybe there is one libertarian he get into his cabinet. And this could be you, since you are the candidate of the Libertarian Party if you want to do it. You mean I could get on board of the Trump regime? Well, which board would that be? Maybe education. Okay, I'm not sure. What do I actually have to do? Well, standing on stage next to, what is this gay guy's name? Klaus Oliver? I have forgotten him. Chase Oliver, I think. And then I was in this conversation with Dennis Pratt of the Free Staters in New Hampshire, and he actually told me the story of the edible, and I thought this was one of the most badass things I've ever heard. Normally, Michael Rechtenwald, before he goes on stage, he has a vape pen to calm a little bit down his nerves. And he wasn't allowed to do that because Donald Trump and the security agents were everywhere, and they took his vape pen, and someone said, "There's no problem here, you got a gummy bear." And he ate that, and it was far too strong, and so he went on stage, and he was just high and stoned out of his mind, and he still, Rechtenwald got wrecked, but I don't know if he expected anything more of that. But it was into the show, and he was just standing on stage and making democracy and everything of these parties completely ridiculous. And I thought, actually, this was a part where you can say, like Dave Smith is saying, look at the debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, or Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. You will never see this again. Donald Trump was fact-checked on stage. There was commercials on TV at the presidential debate, and we will never see this again. Social media is getting far bigger right now, and now we have this situation where a president can no longer hide from everyone else, but you have to be present and be in contact to actual people. And so the Libertarian Party National Convention, where Michael Rechtenwald at this candidate for the LP and Donald Trump on the other side, they shake hands, and they are people ready for taking over the power of the United States, of the most important and dangerous state that has ever existed. And it becomes like a farce. It is getting into the heads of the people that this will no longer, this form of democracy you were used to the last decades, is no longer the point of the future. And I think these progresses, everything that is involved in there, has to be part of the mindset of people, that they actually think, this is no longer a concept for our future. And I don't think adhering to 100% libertarian principles that they are carved into stone. I think there is a basic libertarian principle, but within this principle, there is a very free range of how people want to live culturally. And as I mentioned in the beginning, at the Free Cities Conference, I met Stefan Kinsella, and Stefan Kinsella published this short part of the universal principles of freedom. And I translated this part from English to German. You can already download it, watch it at stefankinsella.com, the universal principles of freedom, and you can find it, of course, in the video description. And this is pretty much the baseline. So why are we dividing? Well, because of the virtues of selfishness. LiquidZulu is an ego who wants to get the, from his perspective, so deserved attention because he's making so much for libertarian theory. And Dave Smith is like, I don't care that much about a strict form of theory. I want to get the basic idea to everyone out there. So long story short, I think Dave Smith does a much more interesting and successful job than LiquidZulu actually does. I don't think LiquidZulu is a bad person, and I don't think he is wrong at everything. But I think if LiquidZulu would just not making himself such an ass with such ridiculous demands and such crazy examples, then they could better be learning from each other. They could seriously debate each other and say, look, Dave, this is a bad way to put things, but you could better get it with this sentence, the complete message out there. I think that's what they could actually achieve. But yeah, I'm used to that. Nobody listens to anyone else, not because they don't agree with each other, they don't think it's true, they don't think it's actually libertarianism, but they think this has to be about me. This has all about to be about me. And I think this objectivist virtue of selfishness is wrong. Ron Paul disagrees with Ayn Rand on this as well. And I think all in all, Dave Smith does a better job of this. So I want to leave it with that. And I hope this was not too long, like 3.5 hours.